Deforestation has a really big impact on the health of local communities in the Gran Chaco area. For one, it changes local weather patterns. They've become much more extreme. The Chaco is a tropical and subtropical dry forest area, and it has already been prone to seasons of inundation and heat waves, but those have become a lot more extreme in recent years, and that makes it very difficult for people to even do very, very small scale subsistence farming in their backyards. I'm talking like 5 hectares for the little garden. Even that becomes very difficult. It has also, deforestation, as understood as a process that's part of agribusiness expansion, has also led to massive unemployment in the area. So you had before huge industries that were not only about picking cotton or harvesting cash crops, but also the factories and shops and textile industries and all of this that were related to these local cash crops that no longer exist. So you have mass rates of unemployment, and people have nowhere to go and no work because the work they've been replaced by machines, basically. So that's another effect that this has had. As a result of that, there's been waves of what I would call rural urbanization, which means that in addition to people going to big cities to try to get work, let's say as maids or as construction workers, and living in slums around big cities that are pretty dangerous and very polluted. They also, a lot of them have been going to rural towns that are kind of becoming rural cities, but that don't have the infrastructure that a city should have, so that they don't have public transportation, they don't have proper plumbing and electricity to handle that many people. And so you have constant power outages and things like this that are, it's one thing if that happens to someone's local house, but if that happens in the hospital, you can have some really there are other kinds of, there are many different kinds of loss that people experience, and depending on which community you're from, you might experience it differently. That also goes for pesticides. The poor people are also more likely to be exposed to harsher pesticides, or to have windfall of pesticide sprays that come over a school. That's more likely to happen on an indigenous or poor Creole school than on the schools were attended by middle-class rural people's children, so usually of white settler descent. It's also a kind of environmental racism that's important to take note of. But this environmental racism, I would say, also extends, as you said, to people's mental health and also people's cultural and social well-being and political well-being. Indigenous people, when they lose the forest, experience the loss differently, because for them the forest is not just filled with living things called plants. For them, these are beings, and there are different kinds of kinship networks that they have with these beings, and it may be that there are ancestors living in the forest that have transformed into another kind of being, or that are partly some other being, or it might be that someone themselves feels that they are not only in their body, they are also in some part of the forest. So it could be an attack on the self in a way that's very hard for Western Europeans to sometimes understand. And I think that this is also a kind of racialized, it's also what I would call an environmental racism, because Western Europeans have the right to their ontologies and mysticisms. We understand when if a bulldozer bulldozes the burial ground next to a Christian church, we understand why this is an assault on people's very being. But we dismiss it when it comes to indigenous ontologies, and that's simply because one of those ontologies is the colonizers and the other is the colonized. So there's also that to consider, this assault on people's sacred sites, people's families, people's kin networks. And I would say that these are political ontologies, to use a perhaps complicated term, but I think a useful one that some research. Deforestation rates have already been steadily rising in the region, but the pandemic has exacerbated this, and we see this all over South America, not just in the Gran Chaco, but also in the Amazon. However, whereas in the Amazon, there are NGOs who are tracking this and flagging it, and there are documentaries about it. The word is out about that, and it's kind of like a fight between Bolsonaro and the people who are against Bolsonaro's destructive policies. In the Gran Chaco, you have a lot less international awareness. There are fewer NGOs focusing on the Gran Chaco region. Probably many of the people watching this would have never heard of the Gran Chaco region if they hadn't watched this video. Compared to the Amazon, which everybody has heard of, and everybody knows that there's this thing called the Amazon in Brazil. So it's in a way easier for people to get away with breaking rules when the rules themselves and the region itself is so invisible to so many people at an international scale. If you've been to these forest areas, and if you know the people who are attached to these forest areas and how they've lived there, and then you see these satellite images, for example, of these areas just being burnt to a crisp, it is actually quite devastating. I mean, it's such a huge scale, and you know how much people's lives are wrapped up in these forests, and it's just, the magnitude is unthinkable, and it is really devastating. I mean, it's very hard to think of how this can be undone. So